Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. So the advertised title of the talk was a little bit more exotic than just Essence and Necessity. I think it was something like Essence and Necessity, a marriage made in heaven, or Time for Divorce. So just to explain initially what the aim of the talk is and why I gave it that title. So there's a contemporary debate concerning essence and necessity and the relationship between them. And there's an assumption in the background of this debate that there's quite a close relationship between essence and necessity. So perhaps there's a marriage made in heaven there, that they go together at least in one way or another. And the moral of my story tonight is going to be something like essence and necessity need to take a little bit of time apart, spend some time working out on their own who they are and what they are independently, and only then can we decide, or can they decide, whether essence and necessity should get back together and have a more enduring marriage together. So I'm not going to labour that metaphor anymore, that's just to explain why that was there. So what I want to do tonight is to cast doubt on an assumption underlying recent and ongoing debates in contemporary metaphysics concerning the relationship between essence and necessity. So what I'm going to do is first of all just introduce the background for those of you who aren't familiar. So I'm going to say what kind of necessity I'm talking about, which is de re metaphysical necessity. So I'm going to say a bit more about what that is. I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean by essence in this context, and then give you a brief overview of the current state of a particular debate about these things, namely whether we should understand one in terms of the other, kind of which way round the direction of explanation goes. Then I'm going to say something about why we shouldn't give an account of essence in terms of necessity, and also why we shouldn't give an account of necessity in terms of essence. So kind of we can't go either way. And then the suggestion is going to be that we need to take a step back from that debate. So I'll finish by making some broad suggestions for the future. Okay, so first of all then, what is de re metaphysical necessity? So we can make a distinction between de re necessity and de dicto necessity. So very roughly, de dicto means something like of the word, de re means something like of the thing. So de dicto necessity is necessity as it applies to what I'm going to say sentence-like entities. So you might think it applies to sentences or to propositions or something like that. But the idea is that it applies to things where the mode of expression is important. So compare necessarily 8 is greater than 5 with necessarily the number of planets is greater than 5. And I suppose I should say, I mean, planets orbiting our sun, so we found out this week that there's at least 7 other planets out there. So I'm just talking about the ones in our solar system. And also, you know, updated because now Pluto isn't a planet, apparently. Okay, so necessarily 8 is greater than 5, that seems true. 8, the number 8, just has to be more than 5. But if we consider necessarily the number of planets is greater than 5, that seems false. It seems reasonable that there could have been fewer than 5 planets. But the number of planets is 8. Aren't we talking about the same thing? Well, this is a case where the mode of expression makes a difference to whether applying necessity to that sentence gives us something true or something false. Okay, compare then de re necessity. So de re necessity is necessity as it applies to individuals, regardless of how we refer to them. So, for example, something like 8 is necessarily greater than 5. We're just there trying to say something about 8, namely that it has to be greater than 5. Rather than applying necessity to a sentence about the number 8, we're just trying to talk about 8. Another kind of example that's popular amongst a lot of philosophers is the kind of thing, the kind of claim like Socrates is necessarily human. So again there we're making a claim about Socrates, that this individual is necessarily human, and it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the way we're referring to Socrates. It's not connected to something like the name, it's really just we're trying to say something about Socrates. Okay, so there are more precise ways to make that distinction, but that's enough just to hone in on the kind of necessity I want to talk about this evening. We're talking about necessity of necessary properties ascribed to individual things. Okay. Another distinction we can make when we're thinking about necessity is between different kinds of necessity. So, for example, we might pick out natural necessity, which might roughly be something like whatever's required by the laws of nature. So you might think it's required by the laws of nature that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. So perhaps it's naturally necessary that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Compare that with something like logical necessity, which seems to be connected to the laws of logic. So it doesn't seem to be ruled out by the laws of logic that anything could travel faster than the speed of light, so it seems to be logically possible. And then there's metaphysical necessity. So metaphysical necessity is perhaps less familiar. It's difficult to give a kind of clear gloss on what exactly it is, because philosophers disagree on whether there is such a thing, or whether it's really just natural necessity, or whether it's really just logical necessity. But I'm going to give you a rough idea just to give you the sense of what I think philosophers mean when they talk about metaphysical necessity, which is a necessity connected to something like the most general requirements of being. So again, if we take our example, whether nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, that might be required by the laws of nature, but you might think that just the most general requirements on there being things, on things existing, aren't so strong as to rule out things travelling faster than the speed of light. So perhaps the laws of nature might have been different. There could still have been things that behaved in a different way. So again, maybe that's not metaphysically necessary. Okay, so the kind of necessity I'm talking about this evening is de re metaphysical necessity. So it's a kind of necessity that pertains to things, not how we refer to things, and it's connected to something like the most general requirements on those things existing or on their being, not anything to do with the particular laws of nature of the world that they're in, or connecting to the laws of logic or something like that. Okay, so much for necessity. What do I mean by essence? So there is a meaning of the word essential where it's just synonymous with necessary. Okay, and maybe this is a use of the word essential that you might have come across, especially in non-philosophical contexts. If that was just what we meant by essence, if it was just synonymous with necessary, then kind of debates about the relationship between essence and necessity wouldn't be that interesting anymore. It would just be kind of trivial. Okay, so that's not the sense of essence that I have in mind this evening. There seems to be a different, slightly different notion of essence, at least that's in play in the kinds of debates I have in mind. So the notion of essence that has come to play a role in these debates is something more like those features of an entity that are important to the identity or the being of a thing. So I've got some examples. So consider Socrates again. Socrates is a human being. He's also such that 2 + 2 = 4. He's Greek and he's well known. So only the first is usually taken to be essential to him in this sense. So it seems to be part of what it is to be Socrates, or part of the being or identity of Socrates, part of what it is to be that individual entity and not any other, that it's got to at least be a human being. Compare Socrates as being such that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, of course he is, and he has to be such that 2 + 2 = 4. Everything is, because it's necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4. So if you exist, you better be such that 2 + 2 = 4. But it doesn't really seem to be central to the identity or being of Socrates, central to what it is to be that thing rather than any other, that he be such that 2 + 2 = 4. And again, consider his being Greek and his being well known. These seem to be utterly contingent properties of Socrates that aren't at all essential to him. Seems that it's not kind of part of what it is to be that individual, that it's Greek or well known. He could have been, for example, a very obscure Roman philosopher, maybe. Okay, so that's just to give you some examples of, or an example of the kind of thing that philosophers have had in mind when they're talking about this notion of essence. This is sometimes called the real definition of a thing. So, for example, Kit Fine writes, and this is on the handout, essence has been conceived on the model of definition. the concept of essence has then been taken to reside in the real or objectual cases of definition, as opposed to the nominal or verbal cases. So Fine's idea is, well, just as we can give a definition for a word, and in giving a definition for a word, we in part say what it is to be that word. I mean, it seems plausible that part of the nature or identity of a word is what it means. So if we define the word, we're saying something about what that word is. So we can give definitions for non-words, so for other kinds of things. So, for example, Socrates, I can give a definition of Socrates, and part of my definition of Socrates might be that he's a human being. And of course, this idea comes from Aristotle, and I have a quote from Aristotle as well on the handout. A definition is a phrase which signifies the what it is to be. So it's this idea of essence as the what it is to be something. So part of what it is to be Socrates is to be a human being, but it's not part of what it is to be Socrates that he's Greek. That's just an accidental property of him. Okay, so one final clarification. Something like being a human being, I'm saying it's part of what it is to be Socrates that he's a human being. Obviously, that isn't distinctive of Socrates. It's not enough, it's not kind of sufficient to be Socrates that you're a human being, because of course, presumably we're all human beings and none of us are Socrates. So I'm not talking about a notion of essence, which we might call individual essence, where these are features that are sufficient for the identity of an individual thing. So, for example, some philosophers have argued for the essentiality of origin, where the origin of something is supposed to be sufficient to individuate it. For example, Socrates is the one and only individual that had his actual parents, that kind of, or that came from the particular gametes that he came from. So it's proposed that that kind of thing is sufficient for the identity of Socrates. I'm not talking about that kind of essence this evening. I'm just focusing on cases of more general features that we can share, like being a human being, but which it's claimed are particularly central to what it is to be, for example, Socrates. Okay, so these are the notions of essence and necessity that I have in mind. What does the current debate say about them? Okay, so lots of things are said about essence and necessity, but I'm honing in on one particular debate that's maybe been going on for the last 20 years, in particular earnest, which is whether we should explain essence in terms of necessity or necessity in terms of essence. So there's a traditional view, which is that A is essentially F, just when A is necessarily F. So we just take essence and necessity to be more or less the same thing, in the senses of essence and necessity I'm talking about. More precisely, to allow for contingently existing individuals, it's sometimes put like this. A is essentially F, just when necessarily, if A exists, then A is F. So we don't require, for example, that Socrates exists necessarily. We're just saying that, well, whenever he does exist, if he does exist, then he'd better be a human being, if he's essentially a human being. So there have been counterexamples to this traditional view, perhaps most prominently offered by Kit Fine in his 1994 paper, Essence and Modality. I won't go through all of the examples, but just to give you a couple. Socrates is necessarily distinct from the Eiffel Tower, so that follows from the necessity of distinctness. They're actually distinct, so they're necessarily distinct. So Socrates is necessarily distinct from the Eiffel Tower, but it seems plausible to say that he's not essentially distinct from the Eiffel Tower. The argument goes, there doesn't seem to be, in order to say what it is to be Socrates, in order to tell somebody about the most central features that are connected to his identity or his being, we don't need to mention the Eiffel Tower. To give another example, as I said before, Socrates is necessarily such that 2 + 2 = 4. But again, it doesn't seem to be that Socrates is essentially such that 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't seem to be any part of what it is to be Socrates that we should need to make reference to any numbers to explain kind of what it is to be Socrates. Maybe we need to talk about his being a human being, maybe some other central features of him, but nothing to do with arithmetical truths. Okay, so there's a certain point in the debate where I think everybody, or within this debate, everybody agrees that these counterexamples are decisive against the traditional view, but then two broad options are taken from that point of what to do. So the first option is to say, well, we can still define essence in terms of necessity, it's just we need to add another condition beyond just being a necessary property to our definition of essence. So for example, it's been suggested that A is essentially F just when A is necessarily F, and F is a sparse property, so adding an extra condition there that F has to be sparse as well as necessary. Or it's been suggested that A is essentially F just when A is necessarily F and being F is non-trivial. Again, there's another extra condition being put on what F has to be like. Okay, so that's one broad option. Stick with defining essence in terms of necessity, but add some extra conditions. There are other proposals out there. The second broad option is to do things the other way around and to say that necessity has its source in essence. So there are all the things in the world, they all have their essences, and from those kind of bubble up a broader class of necessities. So the most fundamental notion there is essence. And you get claims like the following: it's necessary that P, because it's true in virtue of the essences of some things that P, or it's necessary that A is F, because it's true in virtue of the nature of A that it's F. And my suggestion is basically that neither 1 nor 2 looks to be a particularly successful option. And if we can't go down either of those broad routes, then maybe we need to take a step back and question some of the assumptions that got us there in the first place. Okay, so now I'm going to look a little bit more closely at options 1 and 2. So first of all, trying to get essence from necessity. So I'm not going to say a great deal about this option because it would involve a lot of detail and toing and froing from various proposals and responses and so on. So I want to just say something more general about the state of the debate there. So there have been various attempts to give this extra condition on F in the literature. For example, I've given you a couple of examples. So Wildman has suggested that F has to be a sparse property to be an essential property, or Della Rocca has proposed that being F has to be non-trivial. It's not a property that just everything has. So you get attempts to give the extra condition, and then you of course get replies and counterexamples. So there's a paper by Skiles arguing against the sparse proposal. There's a paper by Gorman where he argues against the non-trivial proposal, and so on and so forth. And I just want to make the more general observation that prospects in this debate, to me, don't look good. So it's becoming the kind of debate where initially there was a really nice simple proposal, okay, and it turned out the simple proposal didn't work. Okay, then someone made a slightly more complicated proposal. It turned out that didn't work. There were these counterexamples. So people come back and try and get around it by making it slightly more complicated, but then we find more counterexamples and so on and so forth. And it just doesn't look, at least so far, like that avenue is going to bear fruit. Maybe it will. At least at the moment, prospects don't look good. I mean, I also have a kind of general worry that if we have a notion of essence which is meant to be very simple and intuitive, but we can only give a definition of it in terms of a very, very, very complex condition on the other side, then maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some slight mismatch there. Should we really be looking for a very, very complex definition of a concept that's meant to be very simple and intuitive? So I'm going to shelve option 1 for now and just take it as read that it's not looking hopeful. I want to spend a lot more time talking about the second option. And the second option has become very popular, and there's now a lot of literature where it's kind of taken for granted that there's a fundamental notion of essence and that we can understand necessity in terms of essence, and that's the kind of jumping off point for a lot of work now. And I'm still a bit suspicious about that first step, that we can give an account of necessity in terms of essence. So the idea is supposed to be we've got all the things in the world, they have their essential properties, and somehow that gives rise to necessities. And it seems that the way it's going to give rise to necessities is if those properties are not only essential to the things, but they're necessary. And then once we've got all these necessary properties, they can combine together to provide a wider class of necessities. The question is, why think that essential properties are necessary? So not taking, so the idea is we have an independent notion of essence here. We just have this idea of features that are very central to the identity or being of something. We haven't yet built in the notion of necessity, and the question is whether there's any reason to think that those kinds of features will be necessary features. So how do we get from essence to necessity? And I'm going to look at what seem to me three different routes we might get there. There might be other routes which I'd be interested to hear about in discussion, but at least I'm just going to look at these three. So the first will be if we think of essential properties as required for persistence and destruction conditions, and whether that gets us to necessity. The second will be if we think essential properties are required for individuation, and whether that gets us to necessity. The third is more of a kind of diagnosis, why I think a certain way of thinking about counterfactual scenarios for various things, thinking about trans-world identity for things, can lead us into thinking certain features are necessary when maybe that's a bad way of thinking about trans-world identity. Okay, so in the first two cases, I'm going to present the following form of argument. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the idea that essential properties are required to play a certain role. Let's call it role R. Then I'm going to argue that role R can be successfully played by contingent properties. Therefore, the argument goes, we shouldn't argue that essential properties are necessary on the basis of their being required to play role R. So it may well be that we do need properties that look like this kind of essential property to play this role, but so long as properties that are contingent are perfectly sufficient to play that role, then that doesn't mean that essential properties are necessary properties. So that's going to be my form of argument. I guess in the Q&A I'll be looking for suggestions why I'm wrong, and that really if properties are playing role R, they really have to be necessary. So that's what I'm going to be pushing against. Okay, and also, I mean, in the next two arguments, I'm particularly indebted to Penelope Mackey's book, How Things Might Have Been. So I should clarify, there's a slight modification of focus here, although I think, so I'm kind of convinced by her arguments in that book, but there's a slight modification of focus. So when Mackey's writing about essentialism and essential properties, there I think she really means necessary properties. So when she's arguing, so when she offers arguments, they tend to be arguments for the idea that, well, these properties aren't essential, meaning they're not necessary. So I'm modifying these arguments slightly because I want to start with a notion of an essential property which is distinct from the notion of a necessary property and argue that that isn't a necessary property. But I mean, it's partly just a terminological difference, but I need to add in an additional bit at the beginning that this kind of property playing this kind of role looks like an essential property in the sense I've introduced in the first place. Okay, so hopefully that will make sense as I go through the examples. Okay, so the first role I'm going to consider is explanation of persistence and destruction conditions. Okay, so the starting point for this is to observe that there are some changes that things can survive and some things that things don't survive. So, for example, take a table. If I paint the table a new colour, it seems plausible to think that the table can survive being painted a new colour. If I put it through a wood chipper, it seems plausible to conclude that the table doesn't survive. I can survive going to get a haircut, but it seems plausible that if a giant anvil was dropped on me from a height, I wouldn't survive that. I wouldn't survive the changes that that would bring about in me. Okay, so how do we explain the difference between changes that a thing can survive and changes that a thing can't survive? Well, here's a proposal. A thing will only survive changes under which it retains its essential properties. So we can use the idea of an essential property as what it is to be something, as a property very central to the identity or the being of a thing. Well, if it lost that property, it wouldn't be that anymore. So what I say on the handout is the properties required for the continuing existence of an individual might be called the what it is to be that individual, for if they are lost, then that individual no longer is. So we've got a proposed answer to our question. Essential properties are going to help us explain the persistence and destruction conditions of things. Okay, so if essence does play this role, what must it be like? What must essential properties be like? Well, it looks like essential properties must be at least permanent. So if these are properties that you can't lose on pain of ceasing to exist, then you must always have the properties. So it seems reasonable to say, for these essential properties, for an essential property F, if A is always F. So if A is essentially a table, then, so let's suppose what's essential to the table is perhaps its form. Okay, and that helps us to explain the changes it can survive and can't survive. So maybe there's something essential about the form of a table, that it has to have a certain kind of flat surface and be raised off the ground or something. That means it's always got to be of that kind of form. It retains its form if we paint it, it loses it if we put it through the wood chipper. So we've explained our initial puzzlement in terms of that essential property. Okay, so it looks like essence has to be permanent, but I don't see why it has to be necessary. And this is again a point that I'm indebted to Mackie for. It seems that persistence and destruction conditions could have been different. Okay, so schematically, had A been G rather than F, then being G would explain the persistence and destruction conditions of A. So it might be that I'm essentially a human being, and my being a human being explains the changes under which I will survive and the changes under which I will cease to exist. And that being so, it looks like I must always be a human being. If I exist at all, then I better be a human being. But surely I could have been something different. So it seems plausible perhaps that I could have been a robot. And had I been a robot, then my being a robot perhaps would explain my persistence and destruction conditions. So just because I always have to be a human being, given the role that property plays for me, actually, it doesn't follow that I must have been a human being, that I couldn't have been anything else. Okay, so the idea is then this role can be played by contingent properties, so we can't get from essence to necessity that way. Okay, let's have a look at another role, the individuation of things. So again, the discussion here is a kind of modification. So I'm taking inspiration for the account of the role that might be played by some properties, in particular from Wiggins, Sameness and Substance, and his work on essence. But again, it's a slight modification because there, I think essence and essentiality is understood in terms directly of necessity, where I have in mind this kind of more Finean notion of essence, and I want to see if we can get from this Finean notion of essence to necessity. So I'll try and say something like the Wiggins view on sortal concepts might give us some meat to put on the bones of this idea of essence, but this idea of a sortal property doesn't get us to necessity, so we can't get from essence to necessity round that way. Okay, so what's their view? What's the role that these properties are supposed to play? So we start out with the idea that individuation of things requires sortal concepts. So roughly the idea is, I look around the room, I'm presented with the world, I want to pick out some individual things. I can't just go, oh, this thing, that thing, the other thing. That's not sufficient. I can't just kind of pick things out of the world cold. I need sortal concepts to help me. So a sortal concept is a concept that helps us to count. So human being is a sortal concept, I can count human beings. Loaf is a sortal concept, I can count loaves of bread, but I can't count bread. I need these concepts. I mean, I think bread is a good example. You can't just count bread, you need to carve up bread, as it were, into countable things, like loaves or slices of. Okay, so that's the broadest notion of a sortal concept. And that helps us to individuate things. Okay, so when I'm looking around the room, I can't just pick out this, that, and the other. I pick out this human being, this chair, that chair. So I need a sortal concept to help me individuate things in the world. There are lots of sortal concepts. Not all of them are going to play a very fundamental role in the individuation of things. So maybe philosopher is a sortal concept. You can certainly count philosophers, but the thought was that maybe philosopher isn't supposed to be something that's going to be essential to Socrates. You know, he has to be a human being, goes the view, but he could have been, you know, a cobbler or a lawyer or something other than a philosopher. So we can introduce, and again, this is a kind of rough approximation. We can introduce something like Wiggins's notion of a most general or ultimate sortal. And these are going to be much more fundamental sortals. So whilst it's right that we can count, say, philosophers, we can count bus drivers, what they share is that they're all human beings. It seems to be the more fundamental sortal there is human being or animal, something like that. Or we could count leopards, we can count lions, but there's a more fundamental sortal there, maybe feline or animal again. Okay, so I'm not going to judge on where exactly the line falls, but the sortals that are really meant to be doing the work in individuation are much more basic. Okay, so then where do we get from here? How do we start to get from here to necessity? So there's one idea, which is roughly that sortal concepts of this kind are so central to our being able to even conceive of individuals that then if we really need a sortal concept even to be able to conceive of an individual, then that individual couldn't be otherwise than falling under that sortal. So if we can only even pick out Socrates according to his being a human being, we can only even think of Socrates as falling under a sortal like human being, then if we try and think of Socrates as not falling under the sortal, then we're going to run into trouble. It's just too central to our being able to think about Socrates in thought, to being able to individuate him. Okay, and then this leads us on to the idea of a principle of individuation, or this is kind of connected to the idea of a principle of individuation. So the thought is that these more general sortals by which we're able to pick things out provide things with a principle of individuation, explain the conditions under which things are the same or different at a time or over time. So that's the kind of, I think that probably encompasses the thought before of persistence and destruction conditions, because it encompasses, for example, identity over time. So it's part of, so Socrates is a human being, and his property of being a human being is what explains what things in the past and the future he's identical to and what things he's distinct from. Okay, so that's a very rough picture of some views we might have about sortals. Sortal concepts play a very central role in our individuation of things, and the properties to which those concepts correspond, the things that objects have when they fall under those concepts, seem to play an important role in explaining the identity and distinctness of those things. It seems plausible to me to flesh out the rough notion of essence I gave you at the beginning in these kinds of terms. So it seems plausible to say that the sortals that play these roles are essential to the things in the sense I introduced earlier, because they're intimately connected to the identity of the things. So here's where I'm definitely departing, I think, from the letter of Wiggins's view, because I'm trying to marry up this with the kind of Finean approach to essence. So we have a kind of fairly concrete idea of how sortals might be connected to individuation of things, and then the idea is, well, why don't we use this to give us a better grasp of this real definition notion of essence? Well, these sortal properties are intimately connected to the identity of things, and isn't that what we were talking about? Features of things that are very central to the identity or being of something. Okay, so if these kinds of properties are going to have to be necessary properties, that gives us a way to argue that these essential properties in the sense I introduced would be necessary. So first, just to comment on whether or not sortal concepts do indeed play this role. It's worth pointing out that there is work saying that maybe they don't. So for example, John Campbell has argued that whilst we do need some machinery to help us individuate things and pick things out in the world, we don't need anything quite as rich as sortal concepts. So there's a question whether essential properties do play this role, but I'm going to grant that they do. And granting that they do, I'm going to follow Mackey in arguing that they don't need to be necessary. Okay, and there's kind of two arguments that I'll consider. So first of all, you might think that, okay, so consider something like Socrates. We're trying to imagine what Socrates could have been like. So we're trying to consider different counterfactual possibilities for Socrates. How must he have been in different counterfactual scenarios, and how could he have been different? So you might think that in order to, as it were, keep grasp of Socrates, keep a hold of Socrates when we're considering these counterfactual possibilities, we need him to share some actual characteristic with the actual Socrates. He needs to be similar in at least some respect in order for us to be able to identify Socrates in these counterfactual possibilities. So the proposal is, well, there must be some actual characteristic of an individual which it has in any counterfactual possibility that we're considering for some individual, it had better share some actual characteristic with our actual individual. But the problem is we can't infer from that there is some actual characteristic of an individual which it has in all counterfactual possibilities. Okay, so that inference would be like saying, well, everybody loves someone, so there's someone that everyone loves. Okay, just because for everyone there is someone that they love, it doesn't follow that there's some really lucky person, or maybe unlucky person, I don't know, that everybody loves. So just because in any counterfactual scenario we're considering, Socrates has to bear some resemblance, as it were, to the actual Socrates, it doesn't mean that there's some special property that he has in all of these counterfactual scenarios, for example, being a human being. Okay, so that's not going to help us get there. So then the idea is, the next proposal is, well, maybe it's not enough to simply share an actual characteristic, and this is where our idea of individuation comes in. Perhaps it's much more plausible that when we're considering counterfactual possibilities for individuals, in these counterfactual possibilities, our individual has to share not just some actual characteristic, but some actual characteristic that's sufficient to individuate the individual. Or that, by that I mean some characteristic that could give that individual a principle of individuation. Okay, so when I'm thinking about Socrates, how he might have been Socrates in these counterfactual scenarios, it's not enough that he's similar in some respect to Socrates. He's got to be similar in some respect, well, kind of counterfactual Socrates has to be similar in a respect which, a property which would be sufficient to individuate him. But if the property that he has that gives rise to his principle of individuation is his being a human being, then he's going to have to be a human being in all of these counterfactual scenarios. Again, the question is, well, why? So it seems right that if individuals need some sort of property to give them a principle of individuation, or if in order to even think about an individual it needs to fall under a sort of concept, then yes, Socrates, as it were, in these different counterfactual possibilities, is going to need to have some sort of property or fall under some sort of concept that could give rise to a principle of individuation. But it's not clear why it would have to be the same one. Okay, so I might wonder how things might have been had Socrates been a very sophisticated robot. In that counterfactual possibility, it looks like maybe robot would be the property that could give rise to some principle of individuation, so I could wonder whether or not Socrates would have survived being melted down for scrap or being taken apart and put back together again, or various questions, and that's going to be connected to his being a robot. But it doesn't look like I'm prevented from considering these possibilities as possibilities for Socrates because I'm not thinking of him as a human being. Okay, so in summary then for that section, I think we can use something like the idea of sortal essentialism to give us more content, bring it together with this Finian notion of essence to give it more content, but I don't think it's going to help us get to the idea of essential properties being necessary. Okay, so in the the next section, this is more of a diagnosis. So I think, not in all cases, but in some cases, when we try and think about these counterfactual scenarios for things, we're led into thinking that they need to share properties with the actual thing, because we're thinking about things in the wrong way. So, and indeed, in a way, I've been already putting things like that. So think about these counterfactual scenarios, like they're little worlds out there, counterfactual scenarios distant from us. And we want to know what Socrates is doing over there, so we need to dust off our metaphysical telescope, peer through the telescope over at this counterfactual scenario over there, and try and see Socrates, pick out Socrates over there, and see what Socrates is doing, what he's like, how he's different, how he's the same. So we might ask ourselves, which thing in this world W over there bears the identity relation to this other object, A, in the actual world, and what's that thing over there like? Okay, and immediately that sounds weird, because if they're really the same thing, then we shouldn't be talking about, well, there's one thing, as it were, over there in the counterfactual possibility, got one thing here. Oh, what is it that makes them identical? Okay, and then we start getting into some very strange stuff about identity. I mean, Kripke's already said that we really shouldn't think of other possible worlds as distant planets, and that we could just look at them through a telescope and find the things we're interested in. We don't, for example, if A is F, and this is on the handout, we don't need to look through a telescope to find the F over there that's the A, that's our A. Suppose Socrates is a human being and we're wondering how Socrates might have been different. It's not that we need to imagine some counterfactual scenarios, dust off our metaphysical telescope, and look over there and think, okay, well, at least we're looking for a human being. Okay, that's going to help us hone in on Socrates over there. We don't need to. We've already got Socrates. We've already managed to identify him. We're able to think about Socrates. And once we've already kind of got a hold of Socrates, we can just ask how that thing, Socrates, might have been different. So rather than asking which thing over there in that possible world W bears the identity to this thing over here, A, in the actual world, we can ask a better question. Okay, here is A. How could this thing, A, have been different? How could it feature in counterfactual scenarios? There's no worry there about trying to pick something out and needing it to have certain properties to help us. Okay, so you might think there's some kind of actualist assumption behind what I'm saying there, that I'm assuming, okay, we've just got the actual stuff here, and as long as we can pick out the actual stuff here, we're fine. There isn't really any other stuff in other possible worlds or something like that. So I think probably, yes, I am making that assumption. If you want to interrogate me on that a bit more, that's fine. But I feel kind of happy being an actualist today, I think. And notice that in this picture, there still might be a really important role for something like sortal concepts to play, or essential properties in giving persistence and destruction conditions. We might need sortal concepts to get hold of A in the first place. We might need something like essential properties to tell us more about A in the actual world. But the thought is that we don't need to carry those over to considering counterfactual scenarios for A. One thing you might worry about, well, this is all well and good for actual things like Socrates, but what about non-actual individuals? So how could we think about, so I think one of the examples sometimes given is Kripke's seventh son. So suppose we want to think about, well, had Kripke had a seventh son, then that seventh son might have been a philosopher, or he might have been a mathematician, or he might have been a CEO or something. So how can we think about different counterfactual possibilities for non-actual individuals, because we can't kind of pick them out in the actual world. And there I'm happy to say just that there's no compulsion for us to admit genuine de re necessities for non-actual individuals. Just, I think at that point we're stretching the idea of necessity really applying to things. I mean, if there actually aren't those things, then we don't need to account for de re necessities concerning them. Okay, so then what should we make of all of this? I've tried to introduce you to this debate, and I've tried to give some reasons why I think both sides of the debate are going wrong. what should we do? What do I want to say? So is all of this just a very convoluted argument for the conclusion that essence can be contingent? So is this just a very long way of saying, well, essential properties aren't necessary properties? Is that all I want to argue? Well, no. Or not necessarily. So I think it depends on what exactly we mean by essence and what exactly we mean by necessity, and then how they come together. So what I don't want to be arguing that, look, here's this notion of essence, and it's clear that essential properties can be contingent, so we can pack up and go home. The thought is just, well, we need to look more carefully at this notion of essence without already assuming that essential properties are necessary properties. I mean, if this notion of essence is really meant to be an independent concept that can give rise to necessity potentially, then we need to spend a little bit more time fleshing that out, independent of the assumption that essential properties are necessary properties, and then maybe from there we can find out what relationship it has to necessity. So the proposal of all of this is that we should give accounts of essence and necessity independently in order to then discover what, if any, relations hold between them. In other words, I think we should reassess before pressing forward with this debate, rather than just assuming that essential properties are necessary and then getting into a debate about which is more fundamental, whether we should explain essence in terms of necessity or necessity in terms of essence. I think we need to take a step back and question that assumption in the first place, whether essential properties are necessary or whether there's something quite different going on. Okay, thanks.